Welcome to the Indie Writer Podcast, where we talk all things writing and indie publishing. Today, Cari and I are excited to be talking about time travel with A.C. Merkel and Kosoko Jackson. A.C. is an author, musician, and digital artist. What if you could watch history unfold, take a ride on the Orient Express, rock out at CBGB in its heyday, go dancing in post-prohibition Chicago, pick berries under billions of pure starlit pinpoints in 1540s France? That is the premise of his debut urban fantasy. Kosoko Jackson is a digital media specialist focusing on digital storytelling, email, social, and SMS marketing, and a freelance political journalist. Occasionally, his personal essays and short stories have been featured on Medium, Thought Catalog, The Advocate, and some literary magazines. When not writing YA novels that champion holistic representation of Black queer youth across genres, he can be found obsessing over movies, drinking his umpteenth London fog, or spending far too much time on Twitter. His YA debut, Yesterday's History, will come out in 2021, published by Sourcebooks Fire, and his adult-owned Voices queer rom-com, I'm So Not Over You, will come out in 2022 by Berkeley Romance. We're just so excited to have both of you on the show today. Could you, just to launch us off, tell us a little bit about what drew you to writing stories about time travel? Drew, would you like to go first?
Sure. In the 80s, I was a kid and Doctor Who was on Alabama public television. And, I would sleep for a bit and then get back up to see that when I was a kid because I just loved it. And that's why I have this little canine toy here with us. Because I thought maybe it's video and I can show that, but it's not. So but I've always been fascinated with things that relate back to that experience of watching Doctor Who in the 80s, immortality, time travel, and then later it became magic. And so when I decided I was going to write a book to put out there and self-publish, it was a mix of those things. And that's kind of what Her Name is Murder and the Lady Dreamscape series is.
So I decided to write I didn't set out to write time travel fiction. I've always loved science fiction. Doctor Who was also a big influence of mine, 12 Monkeys, and a lot of other cinema. But when I wanted to write a story that focused on queer representation and the struggles of being a queer teen and a Black teen in the present time, and also compare it to what happened in the past, I did a lot of research and thoughts about how books do that. And the most common thing is like letters that explain like a character from the past and a character from the future. And I was like, that's kind of played out. How can we make that special and different and explore that? And then I was like, why not use time travel? And throwing him back in the 60s, kind of like the linchpin of the LGBT and the civil rights movement as a representation of Andre, a Black queer teen, as a holistic representation of who he is, just kind of floated naturally.
Yeah, and I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I've read, I think, the first 5 chapters. I'm just really excited with the way you're playing with it, because both my biggest question when having both of you on is how are you kind of avoiding some of those maybe overdone tropes? And I just love the way that you're using this kind of organ donation as your vehicle for time travel. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, about how you came up with the medium for your character to travel through time?
Sure. So in the very first draft of Yesterday's History, it was actually blood donation. So I have a science background. My degree's in public health. I wanted to be an MD, PhD. So very much like Andre, I wanted to get my medical degree. So I wanted to tie that in somehow. And by using an organ, I really wanted to keep that closeness and personal connection to the McIntyre family and through time itself as a representation of how organs and blood kind of, when you get an organ or you get somebody else's blood, a piece of you is inside of you and it kind of becomes part of you. So I wanted to use that kind of as like a pseudo representation of how when Andre goes back in time, he learns a lot from Michael about himself and takes that with him to the future. So Yesterday is very much like an onion that has kind of like a lot of layers that I was playing with to just kind of make it a little bit deeper. But again, I wanted to do something different and special. I didn't want it to be like an item. I didn't want it to be something that he touches, very much like in other, I cannot remember, like it's the one that everyone talks about with time travel with the rock and the stone and the woman who goes back to Scotland. Outlander, yeah. Thank you. I didn't want to rock like an Outlander. And so I was like, how can I make it different? I was like, let's go with an organ.
Okay, cool.
That is freaky. An organ. That's awesome.
Thank you.
So do you want to jump in there, Drew? We were just talking about how you decided what medium your character would use to kind of provoke the time travel story.
Sure. So the interesting thing about the way my series goes is in the first book, they're not time traveling. There's a build up to time travel. So there is an item, as was pointed out before, that is passed down through a family history. So that connects that like that in a way. That the love interest uses that can stop time. And as the second book rolls around, we find out that someone has time traveled, which is the call to action that pushes our characters into, okay, so we know this is possible. We have a good reason to go back to fix something, so let's do it. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a mix of items and things that they have to get together and figure out how to make that work. You know, finding a specialist and finding a couple of other pieces that make this all work so that that can happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking how I know that Kosoko, yours kind of you have to also be a historical fiction writer when you're writing these time travel stories, and those who go into the future also kind of have to really up the sci-fi. So how did you decide what era you wanted your characters to visit in these time traveling stories?
So I chose the 1960s and the 1970s again because it's like the nexus of the civil rights movement and the LGBT movement. And because Andre is queer and Black, I wanted that to be a meta narrative about him as a character. It's also a period that we don't see much in YA fiction. YA, for any of your readers that don't know, is young adult fiction. And we usually see much further back in times. Most of our period pieces, which I am a huge fan of, take place during World War I and World War II, but we don't often see the 60s and the 70s. And so I not only wanted to explore that a little bit, but also just set a time that represents Andre and would push him further into learning more about himself, but also in a very, very light sense and a light touch, because the book is not a historical fiction book. So I don't force myself to be as historically accurate in the book. It's a fiction story. I'm not trying to teach people about history. I wanted to give them a little piece of history so they could, if they were interested, go on and find out more.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Really. I mean, like, you went for something a lot closer, and I went for something that was a lot further.
Exactly. Yeah. Very different.
I have a character that is special in the sense that she time traveled in a straight line. You know, she's lived 400 and something years. So when we go back for something from the 16th century, which is forced me into a very historical fiction kind of a mindset. Although, like you said, it's fiction and it's not necessarily historical fiction. So while I took pains to make sure the history was right, I didn't necessarily delve into the dialect too heavily. I didn't want people who were reading it to have to, I'm not having the characters really use modern slang, but I'm also not forsoothing it when we go back that far, because I didn't want people thrown out too much by the language.
Which I'm sure is a big thing, because like if I read a book that had like heavy 14th century language, if characters went back to the 14th century, I would be like, what are these characters saying?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And going to the 16th century, it's not as heavy as it would be if it were the 14th century.
Right.
Because the 16th century is late modern medieval.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's early. You know what I mean.
So that kind of has me thinking about another question, which is, both of you say you're not diving too much into, you don't want it to be a history lesson, you want it to be a kind of a way to explore these times, but still maybe put the fiction front and center. So how do you decide where to draw that line? How do you decide what to give to your readers from those times, and then what to just kind of, not information dump on them? Because I know a lot of time travel stories can get a little over expository and you can lose the readers. So how do you find that balance with exploring a point in time while also keeping the pacing and keeping everybody moving forward?
I don't think I did too well with that, which is one of my personal critiques of my book. I very much focused like this when I was writing it and editing it. I was like, this is a love story about a teen who is in a love triangle and is exploring and learning himself and who he wants to be and using time travel as a vehicle for that. And so I really put a lot of heaviness on that, which to me you can always learn more from and learn from your book that you write and what you did well and what you didn't. I don't think I did the historical piece as well. The book, again, was never meant to be a history lesson, so I didn't really focus that much very specific on historical like events that are happening. There's not a huge talk about Stonewall, even though it happens like right during the period. There's not much talk about the civil rights movement, which is a thing that I regret not doing as much. There's mention of the Vietnam War, but there's never more than kind of just throwaway lines. And even in that regard, like the book takes place in July into August, June through August of 1969 and 1970. And if you are a historical person who was alive or around during that time, there is a very major event during those 2 months that happens, which is landing on the fucking moon. And I don't even mention it at all in the book, which is a huge oversight because everyone would have been talking about the fact that we landed on the moon. So I think I should have, if I could rewrite the book, I would have included more. But at the same time, like, I didn't want it to be a heavy read as a historical fiction book. So I go back and forth
for it.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Exactly. So.
And you found a home for it as it was.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Obviously, there's something there, or these people wouldn't have, published it. And you're so good.
I was going to say, I listened to the book and I loved it, by the way. And I did, I liked that it wasn't, we weren't spending a ton of time thinking about all the different world events because the story was so close on Audrey and Michael.
Right.
And I loved Michael, and I can't say anything without spoiling anything. But, it's so good. You did such a great job. Thank you. And I liked how you used music to bring people back to the time period. Like, again, it's going to spoil it if I keep saying, but yeah.
Because music's a really big component of all my work, too. So I really need to check this out. Cool.
Yeah, I see your guitar's in the back. Your guitar in the background.
Oh, yeah. I got a bass and an acoustic and an electric over there. I spent a lot of time making music, then found out that the way to have a little bit of success, apparently, for me was to write books. So, cool.
And so tell us a little bit about your, how you balanced that, Drew, with, revealing history, but also kind of keeping the story moving.
Well, luckily for me, when I started this out, I picked a time period that I already knew a good bit about. Because of just, it was something I was interested in. And so I kept in a few, like we were saying before, I kept in within a few months. It's, it goes from January 1536 to May. So that's less than 6 months, right? And my brain's freezing. But, I have a really strong idea of what was happening with the characters that I was going to see during that time period. So it was really easy to keep it there. And, I spent research time on picking which of the characters that would have been in this circle were going to be important to my part of the story. And I decided more or less to use lesser people a little bit more. You wouldn't necessarily see on the Tudors or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There were those characters were there in the Tudors, but they weren't big characters. So I guess I drew the line at where, the speech. He didn't want to throw people out too much by saying anything too modern, and at the same time I kind of was like, well, maybe I should have some kind of translation device, and I threw that out. It wouldn't be that hard for us to listen to 16th century English and figure out what they were saying.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So I imagine that point of view plays a really big role in time travel stories. So was that an interesting process for you, figuring out which point of view would serve this story the best? Because obviously if you're going for first person, then, nothing's going to be revealed except for what your character sees, where if you opted for third person, then you could kind of get a little more in there. What did that look like? Did you ever try playing with different point of views, or were you pretty set when you started?
can't write third person, so I don't write third person. But it is, I always try because I'm like, I read third person past the most, but I read some really good third person present, and I'm like, this is such a cool POV. I would love to work with this. Like, this author makes it look so effortless. I can do it. Then I get 200 words in. I'm like, this is trash. Trying to go back to my comfort zone of first person. Why am I trying anything different? So every book I write is in first person, and every book will be in first person because that's what I'm good at, and I know my strengths.
Cool. For me, I guess back when I started reading a lot, there wasn't as much of the first person. All the stuff I read as a kid, it was all third person past tense, and that's kind of how things more were. It didn't become a very popular thing until later. I don't know when, but, so I started out writing in third person past tense, and that worked really well for those first two main books because there's a lot of characters, there's a lot of moving pieces, there's, especially in the second book, there's people that do the time travel and there's people that stay back and are dealing with the things that sent them back there too. So I've got a couple of cast members in different places doing different things, and yeah, some of them don't really get any POV, but if I need a POV, I can take it from whoever I need to with third person. Now, when we got to, I wrote a novella after the second book that is from a character-specific point of view, and it is first-person present tense in that novella, because that's the way it worked out the best. Because I started writing it in third person, and I was like, no, this is going to be so much better if we jump back into this character's mind and see the present, which is their future, through their eyes for the first time.
Right. Yeah, and I think that that subgenre really lends it to being a cool first-person experience. Mm-hmm. But then when you do third, then you get to show the audience maybe some of what that first person isn't understanding yet. So there's a lot of room to play there, I would think.
I'm thinking about, I'm of course thinking about that, I'm the same way that I always write everything in first, and I'm thinking about your book, Jackie, your new one that I'm only, you probably don't even want to talk about it yet, but how you changed it from first to third. And I'm with Kosoko. I am like, oh, I'm going to write in third. No, I'm not.
No, never. I tried.
I thought jumping from third into first was going to be really hard, and in this instant, it was like the easiest thing I ever had to do because it took something that was not working and swung it into this thing where I just sped through it. It was amazing.
I feel like it can open it sometimes. You're like, oh, this needed to be told from a different point of view. I started writing this one book as like a confession letter from the future, and I was just making it way too hard on myself. Mm-hmm. And then I switched to, kind of just a standard third, and it just started pouring out a little more. So
there'll be lots of experimentation for me going forward. I'm not saying I'm going to stick with third or stick with first. First present scared the crap out of me when I started it, and then I was like, no, this is awesome. Let's go.
Right.
So the more things I can do and the better I can make myself, the more, I guess the easier this will be going forward.
I wanted to ask, Kosoko, in your book, a choice that I thought was interesting was that Michael's time and Audrey's time, they weren't exactly parallel, but they did move both forward kind of at the same time. It was like, what, every minute was an hour?
Yep. Yes. Every minute in the past is an hour. Every hour in the past is a minute in the future. Yes.
Right. Yeah. See, I remember that. So how did you make that decision? And I almost thought that it would be almost like a time traveler's wife thing where Audrey would just kind of show up at different parts of Michael's life. And it really wasn't. It was kind of like that, but not quite this. It wasn't out of order like that.
I'm trying to think. This novel has gone through many iterations over the past 3 years. So I'm trying to remember exactly like why that was the choice. I remember in the original draft, it was 1 hour equals 1 hour. So the time was equal. But then that didn't make sense for scenes like in the very beginning when he leaves in the middle of it in the afternoon. Then he would have been gone for several hours. And his parents would have definitely been like, why is our child not in his bed at 7 o'clock in the morning and the next morning? And so it was more of a writer's convenience than anything else, but I still wanted there to be some real world consequences for time travel. So I had it be basically 1/60th. I was really, one of my favorite books is one of my favorite movies is Inception, and that time level of leveled layers, that each level of Inception is usually, I think, 1/24th or 1/60th as you dive deeper into people's dreams, was something that I took from there.
Oh, cool. That's cool. I like that. And I also liked the fact that time had moved forward for Michael, so that when, it had been a while since Audrey visited him, and it was kind of like, where did you go? Like, what's the method to your madness? And then, of course, things change for them later on, but just that kind of, as their relationship was developing, that was an interesting wrinkle.
And I did take that from Time Traveler's Wife with the coming in a different... I think time travel is... What's the fun of exploring time travel if you don't understand the consequences that by jumping backwards and forwards, you're not going to instantly... Each time you jump, it's not going to be back to the exact same moment when you were in the past the last time, because unless you're very masterful of it, in most universes, time is a very hard thing to control, and because it's such a nebulous concept. So the idea of jumping and it being a little bit random, but not being so random that he would jump and Michael would be like 60 years old and then 15 years old and then 20 years old, was what I wanted to play with. If it was an adult book, because in YA it's very, very hard to have an adult main character, also because it has a romance in it too, that was going to get weird if he was an adult.
Could be problematic.
So, right. So if it was an adult book, we would explore different things.
Yeah. I thought about that, and I kept thinking of all the different things that might happen. And it was just so... I loved the fact that the time travel created this extra layer of suspense on top of what was happening with the love story. I mean, it was just so well done.
And you have to have
and there are two love stories, but
yes, it is a love triangle.
I love that too. That was that. I wasn't sure. I forgot the name of the other kid. Was it Blake?
Blake. Yep.
But yeah. I wasn't sure how they were going to get together, but it was very seamless. Like, it made so much sense. I thought, how could he possibly fall in love with two boys at once? And then it was just like, oh yeah, I see how that happens. It was really good.
It's really interesting because that has me thinking about just paradoxes in general. So you were kind of talking, Kosoko, about, what he does can then affect his future when he comes back into the world. It's obviously wrinkled some things. So were there, genre conventions that you were like, I love this paradox, I want to play with it, or there's some that you definitely avoided purposefully? For both of you?
For yesterday, the book does explore like what can happen if you change the past, but I wanted to steer away from like my main character actually changing the past, because that is such a trope in time travel that like you change it, then you realize, oh, my change didn't actually do what I wanted it to do. And I was like, we've read stories like that millions of times, so I wanted to stay away from that. But since it's a story like yesterday is a love story, it is a science fiction story. It is also a coming of age story, but at its core, yesterday is a story about grief. It's about an individuals who have a family who has lost a child/brother, and how each character in this family handles their grief differently, and how characters have lost something. Andre has lost his salutatorian status in school and also lost his purpose. Michael has lost his family after he comes out as gay. Blake has lost his older brother who he looked up to. Every person has lost something, and how time heals things and how it also makes things worse. And so I wanted to really focus on that.
Mm-hmm.
So with paradoxes, I guess that's kind of the thing that I wanted to... Like, I didn't avoid paradoxes, but I kind of had to have my characters being that they're, since they're adult characters and are actively making these decisions, a lot of these things, they had to think about it before they would actually put themselves in the position to do that.
Right.
Because, you know, if you know that going back to X year is going to end the world, well, you'd be kind of stupid to do it. So where he's got the time difference there, I had the time where you can't come back on the same day. Not because you can't, but because, you know, that's a bad idea. There are instances where having people that are the same close together, or items that are the same close together, causes little ripples in the world that you feel, like vibrations, like energy. And a lot of that was like, okay, well, we maybe don't need to do that again. And so we need to be careful, and we need to make sure we go back,
right,
not on the same day. I need to not put these two things together. And, you know, then there's the whole, my paradox that I wanted to push in there is that they couldn't change anything if they wanted to.
Okay.
But they had to be there for everything to happen like it should be. So I guess they could change things if they wanted to by not doing what they would have done in that situation. Like if they made the decision to just not go back, I think things would have been worse for this bunch of characters.
Right.
Because when you get there, you're noticing that things are happening. It's like, well, okay, there's one in particular where a speech that is a known historical speech that is recorded and has first-hand accounts of it, is written out, is delivered by someone other than who was supposed to be there. Nobody knows he's not that person at the time when he's delivering that, because we're in a magical universe and we have glamours. But the character's sitting there going, okay, so if I got it off this iPad and memorized it and now I'm delivering it, where the hell did it come from?
Oh yeah, that's, you know,
it's a causal loop.
Transparent aluminum from Star Trek 4. When Scotty brings the transparent aluminum back, it's like he gives them the formula, and then they're the ones who discovered the formula. So where did the formula actually come from in the first place? It's a paradox.
Right. And I have a Star Trek named chapter, so.
And some of those we did a romance episode, you know, a couple months ago, and some of that paradox conversation reminds me of the trope conversation we were having romance, which it's not paradoxes aren't inherently negative. Like some of them have grown for a reason and they're so much fun to play with. So it's finding the ones that have been overdone and figuring out a fresh spin on them, but realizing that people love them for a reason.
There's a book coming out that I cannot wait to read. I don't know if you all have heard of Rob Hart. He wrote The Warehouse.
Yep, I'm close friends with Rob.
Are you? Oh my gosh,
yep.
Tell him I love it. I love that book. And Paradox Hotel is his new book coming out. I cannot wait for that. It's a time travel murder mystery. Maybe you know about that if you guys are friends.
I do. I know about it. I haven't read it yet, so if Rob hears this, he needs to give me a copy.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, let me text him right now, actually.
He sure does. Oh
Message to Rob.
I cannot wait.
Copies of books, please.
When I saw the concept for that book, I'm like, oh, I am arc stalking that immediately. Him and Kelly Garrett's new book, those are the ones that I am like arc stalking right now.
So maybe we jump to a few of the audience Q&As that people submitted. And that could be fun. Carrie, do you want to read a couple of those?
Let's see. Okay, if I can. How does going backward or forward in time influence the method or device of getting there, if at all? We kind of talked about that a little bit, like the method.
And that's an interesting question in my universe here, because, well, the people that actually go forward in time, we don't see that on the page. So we have to kind of assume that it's a similar method to the going back. But since it's not, you know, it's not in a camp where we've got a POV at that moment, we don't know.
So in mine, to give a little bit of backstory, the story in the book, Audrey gets a liver donation from a boy who was killed in a car accident. And it turns out that individual who he gets his liver from comes from a family of time travelers that have the genetic ability to time travel. So when he gets the liver, he gains the ability to time travel. He only travels back to the past because of something which is called, in my book, which is a rare phenomenon, which is called tethering. And that the house that he lives in where he first time travels is the same house that Michael lived in back in 1969, which creates a connection to Michael Michael, which makes it easy to time travel to him. If Michael never lived in that house and there wasn't this emotional tether, he could travel back into in the past, or he could travel into the future, even though that's one of the 3 rules that time travelers don't break. It's just that traveling back to the past is the easiest for him, close to Michael because of his connection with Michael because of their home.
Yeah, so I guess you could have done it that your genetic ability to time travel could go to the future, but then it would have been a completely different story.
It would have been a completely different story. It would have added in a whole bunch of extra questions, which is why let me knock on wood, because I say I'm never going to write another time travel book, but who knows, careers are long. It was a mess to edit, and I took 4 times as long to edit as it did to write it, and I never want to go through that again.
Right.
That I could see how that would be. I started a time travel book a couple years ago, and it became very convoluted quickly. So I could see how that would happen.
Yeah, I want to see what your world Bibles look like and what your structure looks like for writing these stories, because I'm imagining it's almost kind of like writing a mystery where you have the end in mind first. Is that kind of how it's been for you? I
definitely had the end of the second book in mind when I started it. I knew where that was going, so that made it a lot easier to get everything in place to be there. As far as having a big series Bible and planning everything out, I don't do that. So, it's I get an idea, the story happens, and I know that I want to do a lot more stories with those characters, so it became a series in that way. There's plenty to do there.
Right.
I've opened up enough doors that I could write it forever, but I don't think that necessarily everybody's going to want to read them forever. So I'm making those decisions now. But you're right, if in the sense that it is like a mystery, because you kind of have to know what's going to happen to get them in the right places to make all that stuff line up. And it seems like I might be a little more plot driven, and Kosoko's a little more character driven in that sense. Not to say I don't focus on my characters, but we're talking about a book with some romance compared to a book that's a romance with a time travel spin. So it's also different. We all do things differently. It would be fun to look at each other's notes and stuff.
Totally.
Someone did mention how much tech and engineering is required for a time machine, and I'm
doesn't sound like either of you are using time machines, though.
Yeah.
We're not, but at the same time, I have a book out that's just sci-fi. It's like giant robots in Japan, because I'm a big nerd.
Oh yeah.
But it's got the you just do it the same way. You replace object with machine that's got machinery, and then you probably have to research a little bit more about quantum mechanics and stuff to not mess that stuff up. But I did read a lot about them. But I've been watching time travel shows my whole life. It's kind of second hat now to me, because Doctor Who and I could probably list out more, but right now Doctor Who is the one that pops in my head because it's the one that's been there forever for me. Yeah. So. Reading time travel, watching things about witches, it's just that kind of stuff. It just gets me going, and it's kind of comes out easy because nerd.
Yeah, I mean, we could definitely talk about time travel all day long, but I just saw, Kosoko, that you have this sci-fi thriller coming out in March of next year too. I didn't know you were writing this, or you have written this.
I was like, what? I have another book coming out that I don't know about? Yes, I do. So my second YA comes out March 1st, 2022. It is a science fiction kind of Black Lives Matter meets Attack the Block, about a young journalist, a wannabe journalist who goes to Baltimore to photograph a Black Lives Matter protest, and the governor of Baltimore initiates kind of a giant impenetrable dome over Baltimore that prevents anything from getting out or in, people, information, or anything, and he teams up with a hacker and an AWOL Army Corps female, who all 3 of them team up to try and take down the dome. It's very action-packed. It's probably the most action commercial book I've written. It's very much, I wrote it in kind of a haze after the George Floyd protests. I wrote it, it's a 90,000 word book that I wrote in 3 months. It was very much a very Hayes-driven book. I'm actually doing the copy edits for it right now.
Cool.
Nice. Congratulations.
That sounds awesome.
Thank you.
Start arc stocking it too.
Yep. So I'm sure we'll be getting arcs probably in like this fall.
Soon, yeah. 22. I'm starting to get 22 books because I'm a librarian. I get them early. So I'm 6 months ahead of everybody. I'm ordering. I'm right now ordering for like November and December of 21. So yeah, I did not know about this one. I knew about the rom-com, which I'm excited about too. But I'm excited to see another YA from you.
You know, y'all did a genre hopping episode recently. I'm kind of curious to hear about Kosoko's experience with doing all these books that are so very different.
So Kosoko has never in his life ever done anything that's like the same. Even in college, I think I jumped majors like 5 times in college. If you were to look in my inbox to my agent, I think every week I'm like, I have a new idea. Like, scrap the one that I sent you 3 days ago. This is a new epic idea that we're working on.
Love it.
And so I just like, I've written YA for a long time. A lot of it like just hasn't been published. I'm pretty lucky in the agent trajectory. I got an agent in 2018. First book came out in 2021. So it's pretty lucky. And I have 4 books coming out next year. The paperback for Yesterday comes out in January 1st. Nice. My rom-com comes out 2/22. My second YA comes out 3/1. And then my last rom-com in my 2-book deal comes out in December.
Congratulations.
Awesome.
So exciting.
Thank you.
So much to
look
look
It's a busy year.
Yeah. It'll be fun though. That's great.
Yeah, that's great.
Love to hear it.
Do you have any books coming out this year, or is there something that you have on deck?
Actually, on deck, I have a break because since back in December of 2019, I have put out, I guess what you'd call 2 full lengths, 2 novellas and a short story that are all published, self-published. So right now, I'm kind of like sitting back and, you know, doing advertisement and letting those things grow and build and focusing a little bit on the queer indie organization that we started for indie authors on Twitter, and that's me and Halo Scott and Mario De Olio and Ash Knight and TT Banks, and we just kind of put together this big site that's a directory of where to find not only books that have queer characters and are written by queer authors, but for books that are ally books too. So everything on the site is from all kinds of different people, and it's all safe spaces.
Nice.
We're working on that stuff.
That's great.
Yeah.
And anything that we mentioned that it's not easy for me to find a link, send my way, and I'll make sure that's in our show notes. So we'll get some links going. So we do have a few more audience questions, and then we're kind of rounding up to our hour, and we'll make sure to give you guys, you know, a final chance to tell everyone how to keep up with you and whatnot. But I want to make sure that we don't forget the questions that people sent in.
I mentioned,
you posted.
I did not mention, is there a time period you would never touch in your writing? And if so, why? That's an interesting one.
I want to jump on this one because I had a serious wrestling moment with whether or not I would do this. Because I have a white female bisexual main character, and the immortal partner in her life is a black male and a black gay male. And they have been through all this time together, and, you know, the idea popped in. It's like they could be in America in the 1800s, and then I was like, no, I don't have the life experience needed to put my characters into anything to do with the Underground Railroad. As cool as it is, and as much as I like watching the stuff about that on the TV, that's not my space. So I backed off of that. I like to look at a situation as whether or not I can provide an authentic point of view to it. As a white male, I can definitely talk about kings and queens from England in the 16th century, but there are some places in history that I probably shouldn't be in this place in this time writing about this thing. I need to keep it to things that I just don't have the real experience for that. I could research it forever and never get it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd probably say any point in time past like the 1910s, which is a very short amount of history, but I need my characters to have plumbing I need my characters to speak in a dialect that is reasonable. I need us to not be in... I love Game of Thrones. Love it dearly. I would jump back in time instantly to fall in love with Jon Snow. But we're not going to go back to like times when we had castles and it was like we had huts and things and tents, because I hate the cold. So we're not doing that, and we're not putting my characters through that. And I'm a big lover of like the 1910s period pieces. Any period piece you give me where there's a female main character who has to buck against society norms, falls in love with a kind of like ragged around the edges, cocky guy, and then wait, the Great War pulls them apart. I am a sucker for that. I could watch a million of those, even though I know the Great War is going to come every single time. But anything past that, and I'm like, we didn't have... The plumbing was shit, so I can't... Pun intended, so I can't.
Nice. That's funny. Do either of you ever see writing time travel to the future, or do you think you'll stick with the past?
I don't think I'd time travel there. I've got a character that has the ability to be in a situation where she can just live through to the future. So if I decide to go there, it'll either be... It's not out of the question. It's not out of the question, but it's not high on my list of priorities, I don't think.
Gotcha.
I don't know if I would into the future. Maybe. I feel like time traveling into the past gives your character some grounding in that, like, okay, there's a jarringness of going back in the past, but like I always write smart Black main characters because it's something that's important. I think it's important to see. So them being able to quickly adapt because they have the educational knowledge of the past is important, because it saves a lot of character growth that I can put that time into a different part of the book. If we're jumping 100, 200, 1,000 years into the future, there's customs, there's things you have to learn. I don't write 500, 600-page epics, and I will never write that, because when I see them in the bookstore, I'm like, oof, how do I carry that book? And so I don't have the page attention span to be able to do that. Like, I love space operas. I love to watch them. The Expanse is one of my favorite things out there. I'll never be able to write something like that.
It's good to know. It's good to know what you're interested in, right? It looks like we have one more on our main post. One more audience question. In your books, are there any physical perils associated with time travel?
So for me, the perils of time travel from Audrey are basically that, this is kind of a spoiler, but it's not really a spoiler. Very much like with organ donation, there's always the threat that the organ won't take to the body in natural, normal organ donation. Audrey experiences the fact that time traveling is accelerating this process inside of him. And if he continues to time travel, basically his cells and his organ are basically separating. So there's a physical ailment. Now, Audrey is a unique time traveler, which I won't go into specifically because that also gives more spoilers. But the average normal time traveler inside of this universe that I've set does not experience this, because it's genetically just part of who they are and a mutation of their genes. There's really it's just as easy as somebody who has red hair or someone who doesn't feel pain because of a removal of a gene inside of their sequencing. But for Audrey, he's a little different. So there is...
Gotcha. Okay.
Well, I think I'll go back to what Kosoko said before about plumbing. Plumbing and cold, and, going back that far is definitely an adjustment, even for the people who are originally from there that go back. Because it's like, no, it's just, there's definitely points where it's like, it's January, so that's like, it's too cold. We got a character that's loving being there, and another that's like, get me my heaters, please. So
that would be me.
There's definitely that, and then of course there's diseases, and that is covered with a light touch. But I do bring it up, so it's important to know that, like, it's important that you think about some of those things when you're writing these things, because somebody's going to give you a nasty review if you ignore the fact that there's a sweating sickness in England in the 16th century. It's, you have to know where you're going at least a little bit, or have some idea. Or you're not going to write a successful time travel book, I don't think. I mean, there's keeping it light, and then there's keeping it, too light.
I keep thinking of questions, and I'm like, nope, that's a spoiler. Nope, that's a spoiler.
That's funny. Well, I would love it if you both could maybe, since most of our listeners are indie writers, and maybe as they're listening to this, they're thinking of giving it a try. Have there been any resources that have been very helpful to you as you've written a time travel book that you'd be able to share with us?
Ooh. I found myself in a lot of rabbit holes over the course of these two main books in this series. The Lady Dreamscape series is where I'd go in and I'd be like, okay, so I need to find information about the Orient Express. And then suddenly I've got maps of every train that ran through Europe in the middle of the 19th century plastered across my desktop. And I'm like, oh my goodness, or the 20th century, whatever. The 30s. I've got all these trains up and I'm looking at all this and I know way more about trains in the 30s than I ever thought I wanted to know. But, just remember that a couple of sources and then things like from the 16th century where there's not a primary source for it, you get some leeway and some wiggle room there. You know the things that did happen and you kind of have to make things fit in underneath. And, but use TV shows too. A lot of these things do things that are wrong, but a lot of these historical pieces that come out of the BBC and such, they're getting things very right there. They have books from historians, and like the Spanish Princess is like also wrong, but the writer that wrote it, so that's a good thing too, is to grab the book that inspired some of these things. There's tons of historical fiction out there written by people that are historians. Gemma Lawrence, who is on Twitter as Tudor Tweep, I have read a lot of her books about the period, and so there's lots of info out there that can at least help you set the tone. You're going to want to verify these things because a lot of these books don't have, they're not exactly historical accurate, but you can get a good idea and get a start from just reading.
I'm going to take it from a different point of view that was great advice. I think that it really depends on the type of time travel you want to write. Mm-hmm. I think if you want to write something that is a little bit more literary, then there's like a lot of great things. The Time Traveler's Wife, Kindred, there's just a lot of great, more literary time travel. If you want to write something that I consider like a really good like blend between time travel and literary, Mike Chen has written a great book on that. If you want to write something more action-packed, there's like always TV shows and movies that focus something more person-focused. There's About Time, the movie About Time. I think it's like, what type of time travel do I want to write? To me, time travel is a subgenre. Technically, it's a subgenre. So you can write science fiction, romance, time travel, science fiction, mystery, time travel. It really just depends on how many layers down you want to go, and then try to find writers, movies, books that reflect that, see what has been done, what hasn't been done. I'm a big fan of the writing idea because I think that if you've never written a book before, you're just starting, I really believe, which is how I started, is like writing copies of things. Like I wrote a copy of Harry Potter when I was like 10 that I thought was the most brilliant thing ever. It was literally just a copy of Harry Potter with like 3 differences. But it got me to the point where I was able to look at cinema and look at entertainment and books and figure out, okay, these are the 7 things that I liked about this. Here are the 3 things that I didn't like. How would I do those differerly? Which is honestly a lot of what writing is. You see something great that a writer or a moviegoer doesn't focus on or focuses too much on. And so you want to unspool that little thing and it creates a whole story for you. So I think that's a really good way to do that.
Oh, a lot of great authors came from the fan fiction pool.
Exactly.
There's some really great stuff being written, and because these people don't own the characters, they can't do anything with it. You don't have to skip that step. You can write some fanfic and hone your skills. I might have. Put it. The best thing to do if you want to write anything is to write. Mm-hmm. Write, read, and don't let yourself get crippled by all the advice that's out there, because some of it is like not going to work for you. Having 15 beta readers may be the way X does it, but you may not need that kind of input. That may crush you. You may need just a close friend who can read your work and say, well, maybe you should do this. And I'm a big DIYer, and I've gotten some really great reviews, and a lot of them, not a lot of them for if you're comparing to like big dogs, but I'm an underdog and I'm doing okay. And I'm mostly, I'm a lot of DIY. I have people that help me make sure I don't have everything spelled wrong. But you're going to spend a lot of time editing. You're going to spend a lot of time self-editing. You just need to do it. Mm-hmm. If it's a passion for you, you'll do it. And if it's, if you start doing it and find out that it's, it's okay for it not to be for you. That's fine.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, in library world, we talk a lot about every book its reader and every reader their book. Whatever you're working on is going to be the right book for someone, and probably many someones, and vice versa. That not every reader will gravitate towards your book, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. If it's self-contained and it's the vision that you wanted for that book, and you've done your best, then that will show through, and people will go to it.
Well said, everyone. Well, this has been such a pleasure. This episode, I think, will be really well received. People will be super excited about it, and it was an honor to talk to both of you. But before we go, I would love for you to just let our listeners know how to keep up with you and what you're working on next, and just the best way to read your work, and where they can just kind of follow to see what's going on with you.
Okay, I guess I'll start. The Twitter for me is @blink_drive, and that is a dark matter reference from the science fiction TV show. It was also I was going to do some nerd rock under that name, and there is a recording of that out there, but it didn't. That was when I was like deciding what I was going to do next, because I've always been creative, and I just got to kind of fit those things in. So blink_drive. acmerkel.com is where the hub for all the books is. You go and you click the button and it'll take you to each. There's pages for all the books. I am moving out of Amazon exclusivity as we speak, so by October you'll be able to buy direct EPUBs from the site, and things will be moving out towards they will be on Apple. I'm working on the Google, but right now it's, if you go to acmerkel.com, you can find the things that are out. There are audiobooks for the first two in the Lady Dreamscape series, and Jamie Moore's fantastic. So if you're into audiobooks, you should listen to those, because she's brilliant. And I'm really lucky to have her on my team. And then there is queerindie.com, where we have the directory, and you can get to all the founding members' books from there too, but that's more about that directory that now has over 200 books listed, and you can just kind of go there, and anything you pick up is something that is from people that love you. So that's good. And I think that's most of it.
As for me, Twitter, actually all my sites, Twitter, my website, and my Instagram are all the same. The benefits of having a unique name, Kosoko Jackson, so Kosoko Jackson for Twitter and Instagram, kosokojackson.com for my website. My next book, as we mentioned before, comes out February 2022. If you're into rom-coms, it's a queer-owned voices, fake dating / second chances rom-com. And then if you want more science fiction thrillers, you just have to wait a week, and that comes out 3/1, which is my next YA.
Thanks for listening to the Indie Writer Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode and will subscribe to hear our future episodes. We want to thank the Writing Block community for the continued support. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, or at writingblock.com, no K. Remember to subscribe, share, and tell your friends. Thanks, everyone, and happy writing.